Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Node.js Ask Me Anything session on modules, and thanks for joining us. First of all, I guess we should go over a quick round of introductions. So, in the order I see you, Bradley.
Sure. So I'm Bradley Farias. I work at GoDaddy, and I think I was the first person to try to propose landing modules. So I've been around a while, but it's no longer just me. We have a huge working group, and I've actually started doing less than most of the other working group these days. That's it.
Awesome. Geoffrey.
Hi, I'm Geoffrey Booth. I work at Walt Disney Imagineering. I'm the maintainer of CoffeeScript, and I got involved in this when the current design started to affect how CoffeeScript is going to work, and I've been involved ever since.
Thank you so much. Myles.
Hi, I'm Myles Borins. I'm a developer advocate at Google, specifically working on Google Cloud Platform. I'm on the Node.js Technical Steering Committee and been helping with our release team for a while. I helped to spin up the Node.js modules team, which is currently overseeing the efforts for ES modules and Node.js.
Perfect. And Jan.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jan. I'm also working at Google, like at Myles, and I originally started working on modules in Node kind of from the web compatibility perspective, trying to make it work, to have the same code work in both. And well, not having modules in Node was kind of a blocker for that.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And lastly, I'm Ujjwal. I'm the moderator for the evening. I don't know, it's evening for me, the day, the temporal dead zone. Yeah, and I work as a compilers hacker at Igalia, working on V8 stuff and TC39. And I've been working on Node.js, working a little on the common JS side of things and the embedding side of things when it comes to actually running the code in V8. So it'll be really interesting. Thanks everyone again for the introductions. Just to kick this off, actually, I think it'll be really useful, especially for the uninitiated, to for us to go through the roadmap and talk about the timelines for release and perhaps give some historical context about how we got where we are.
So for roadmap stuff, I guess we could talk a little bit about like what has landed and what could be expected, and then maybe for historic, Brad can maybe kick that off. But the most straightforward stuff right now that's good to know is that ES modules has been unflagged in Node.js as of 13.2. There's two major features that are still flagged that are being worked on, although and maybe Geoffrey or Jan knows a bit better. I know conditional exports and self-referential modules are in the process of being unflagged very soon. Have they been unflagged yet, guys?
Self-referential imports have been unflagged, but only on master. I'm not sure there's been a release of it. Conditional exports is still pending to be unflagged.
The current timeline that we have, though, is hoping to have those features unflagged this month. We're hoping to backport as much of, if not the entire implementation, aside from the unflagging, to Node.js 12 and the next December minor release, with the intention of unflagging everything in Node.js 12 by April for the next December minor release. So, we're kind of living in the future. Most of this stuff has already landed in a release of Node, and in less than 6 months we'll hopefully be living in an LTS version of Node as well.
That is super interesting. Bradley, would you like to expand a little on the historical context?
Sure. So the Node project got involved in ES modules right before they landed in the spec. So ES modules landed in 2015. And the first recording I have of trying to implement them in Node is July of 2014. There's a recording on YouTube for that. But basically from then onward, it was kind of a back and forth. TC39, the JavaScript language standards body, landed ES modules in 2015, but without a plan to actually ship them in browsers or in Node, things got really hairy for a while, meaning that both browsers and Node had to kind of take the spec and figure out how they were going to actually ship it. So for the next few years, Node at least was trying to figure out how they were going to do that. And there's an older process that we no longer use called the EP process for enhancement proposals. And so for a while, we were using these Node EPs to try to design a specification for how we were going to ship modules in Node. And that was around a 2-year long time span in which we were talking with different people and some people in the browsers. It was a very different system from what we have today. Today we use working groups and we have much smaller iterations going on. So we're landing PRs in Node rather than making huge specs. But after this EP process kind of started to wind down, we enter kind of this next life cycle. There's a period of time where we just kind of landed a implementation in Node that is one that we no longer use. And things got quiet for around a year. And finally, Myles started up the modules working group as some contention came up on social media about the implementation that we did land, and we spun up the modules working group. This is around the time that NPM made a counter proposal to the Node implementation of the time, and there were other proposals starting to show up as kind of these counter proposals after we landed something in Node. And so from these counter proposals for around 2 years ago until now, we've had this working group going and trying to agree on what we are going to ship instead. And so, like Myles said, in 13.2, we unflagged a new implementation. It uses a decent amount of that older implementation, but it has a different user experience. And so that's how we got where we are today. And now with the working group, we have meetings quite often, and we are landing PRs. They're open on Node right now. We try to keep them somewhat contained and small. So yeah, if you want to participate, it's much easier than it was in the past.
And just to add something to that, the implementation that was unflagged in 13.2 first landed in 12.0.0. Some of the latest parts of the very newest additions to it, I think, are probably only in the 13 line. But if you use Node 12 and up with the experimental modules flag, that's essentially the same implementation as what eventually got unflagged in the current Node.
That is awesome, and thank you for sharing quite the journey with us, Bradley. Digging into the questions now, a really interesting group of questions that have been submitted deal with how to, start getting dirty with ES modules, right? Because now that it's unflagged, as you mentioned, people are adopting them more and more, even in the more, let me take a look. So, okay, Coming out of the Collab Summit, I had opened an issue for discussion at the NPM RFC GitHub repo about the default settings for use in package.json files and what developers or authors should be considering when creating a package and setting the type properly. So there is this RFC number 75 on NPM, which is an RFC for a feature that should prompt the user for a module type when initializing an npm module. So what do you people think about what the expected workflow is here? Is there any interesting work going on in the tooling side of things to make things easier as adoption grows?
I can kind of speak to this a little bit. So one of the key things that you mentioned here is it's about tooling support. So Node historically hasn't made any recommendations while we've had these flagged features, but now that we have unflagged the type field in package JSON in the 13 line, we're going to see a situation where different tools may have different opinions on what they want to do. I feel personally that in the future, all tools should set the field to some value.
The type field, I think you mean?
Yes, the type field. I feel the type field should pretty much always be populated in the future by tools, but I don't have a strong preference on what the field's value should be. I think that's up to an individual tool. And if we ever add more values to that field, it may change over time what we recommend. That's it.
And something that's probably worth pointing out, I feel like one of the things that people are confused about this or why they're asking is because they're like, well, why should I set a type field if I'm going to have multiple types in my package? Like I'm going to ship an ESM version and I'm going to ship a CommonJS version. A package can contain multiple package.json files. That's always been the case. So if you are shipping multiple artifacts, you could have like, a top level package.json that with a type field that controls whatever you want at the top level, the root folder of your package. And then if you have a subfolder like CommonJS and another subfolder called ES module, each of those folders can have a package.json with a type field itself. So you can be more specific in like describing the things within your package.
That's great. Thank you so much. I believe we're going to see more and more people fiddling with tooling in this area as we get more and more usage. Actually, talking about usage, now that modules and exports is unflagged, we should be able to see the first time relative usage of type module that we were just talking about versus the infamous .mjs extension. So the person who submitted the questionnaire asked, do we have any relevant statistics here? And if not, will someone be collecting this information to inform future modules development? If so, how has it informed the working group working group's thoughts on Node.js's ESM implementation, which also, so this also deals a lot with tooling, but I'm not sure if there's any statistics that are being collected right now, but I'd love to hear your point.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this one. Right, so it is kind of weird coming from the outside looking in to see that Node basically has two different solutions to how do I tell Node that this file is an ES module, right? So you can use type module in package.json, and then you have your .js files that belong to that package.json be treated as an ES module, or you can call your individual files .mjs, and no matter what happens outside of those files, they will always be treated as ES modules. The reason why we have those two solutions is because right now nobody knows which of those two will actually work out. And it is very likely that depending on what kinds of tools somebody's using or what kind of existing code they have, one of the solutions will work and the other will not, or vice versa. So I think the short answer is yes, we are definitely monitoring usage and try to keep a tab on what people are actually doing and what different tools support. But realistically, there are no plans to get rid of one or the other, and I don't think that it's likely that one or the other will go away anytime soon. So what will likely happen is that tools will add support for both, and people will use what works for their projects. And right now, even though there is a handful of packages that might have tried it out, we are definitely far away from any kind of significant numbers that we could look at. Like if 0.001% of the NPM registry downloads are using one or the other, and one is double the other, it doesn't really mean anything, right? It's not statistically significant that there is a big difference if the numbers are very small. But yeah, I mean, it will be interesting, especially for documentation purposes and tutorials and all that kind of stuff, to see what might end up being the more prominent pattern in the ecosystem. Bradley?
Yeah, so kind of in the same vein, we do monitor things. We have different tools for crawling the NPM registry. We try to get statistics, but sometimes it's hard to get statistics on how things work. So what we've been doing is using some source code tooling. Historically, we've only really had MJS as something that we've seen on the registry. So we're starting to see type module stuff show up on the registry these days. But there are other things to consider as well. I don't think many people are going to be transitioning from their current bundler tool chains or compiling of TypeScript to JavaScript, transpiling via Babel, all this. And it's really going to be interesting as people migrate, not just if they're going to be using .mjs or type module, but if they're going to move off their compiler tool chains as well. So with compiler tool chains, you get to an interesting scenario where what you publish may be something that's in a different format than what is actually run by Node. And what I mean is you may push some language up to the registry and it may be TypeScript, but TypeScript could be compiled theoretically to either of these directions. And so you get into a situation where we have to monitor not just which of these solutions is used, but kind of what the ecosystems that generate them is. So there's going to be kind of an ecosystem thing where we have to monitor not just what's out there, but what people are using in their tool chains as well. I'm excited about that.
Yes, it's a couple bits that I want to add to this on the discussion is that just because there's different options that you can use, such as type module, doesn't mean that the value for a file extension such as .mjs doesn't exist independently. .mjs was come to as a way to have an unambiguous extension to reference ESM. And we actually have a new file extension because our team obviously loves them so much, .cjs. And depending on the mode that you're using, if you decide to use type module where the .js extension is now referring to an ESM file, how do you refer to common.js? And that's where .cjs comes in. You know, personally, I think that there's always value in being explicit here. So, you know, I don't see kind of either going anywhere. And ecosystem support for MJS is getting better. There's ongoing work that we've been doing with the IETF to standardize it. The extension is now supported in the Python MIME type database. the friction that people would have had when starting to use it a couple years ago no longer is as much of an issue. Now, I understand that people have aesthetic concerns or personal concerns with it, and we tried as much as possible in the new implementation to make it so that folks can make decisions based on what they want to have. For myself, like I still, even in type module, like using .mjs personally. But, I don't think it's a hill at this point any of us really want to die on. But having the ability to be explicit about both and in a way that's supported in kind of, all previous versions of Node is something that we did care about.
Yeah, and I would just add to that it's not either or. Like, that's kind of why we're encouraging all users to add the type field regardless of what the extension they use, because you can have type module and use the .mjs extension in your files. So that just provides two signals to tooling about what your intentions are, and that can only be a good thing. I think in Node will probably support both indefinitely, and in terms of what becomes more prevalent, I think it's going to depend on how the landscape shakes out with tooling. I specifically joined the group because of the difficulty of supporting MJS for CoffeeScript, in that it would have forced CoffeeScript to create its own new file extensions like .mcoffee and so on. And that would mean updating hundreds of packages around the CoffeeScript ecosystem, which isn't realistic. So likewise, though, there are going to be tools that have trouble using the type field because they're not set up around looking for metadata in a separate file outside the file itself. So these are the issues that we have. I think it's going to depend on whatever your tooling situation is, whatever tools you're trying to use with your project, they might have different needs in terms of what they're looking for and what they support. And so from Node's perspective, Nodes will want to provide, the broadest platform so that tools can do what they want to do. And then, users can figure it out and tools can figure it out, is our hope.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and experiences on this. I'd just like to remind our YouTube audience that please feel free to submit any questions. It's not usual for this group to take questions like this, so it's really interesting to hear all these things and hear the concerns of the community now, especially now, as you mentioned, that ESM is unflagged and you're using it everywhere. So yeah, we'd love to hear your questions. To move on with the conversation, actually, this is super interesting. This is something that just occurred to me, so I just specifically directing this to Myles. Of course, each of you can chime in. Myles, if I'm not incorrect, you're working on this new TC39 proposal called module attributes, which adds module attributes to ECMAScript, right? And it allows people to import essentially JSON modules and HTML modules and stuff like that. So I've been wondering how can it correlate, if at all, with Node.js ESM, and does it have any interesting thing in store for how we approach this interoperability problem?
Yeah, so bit of history here. So last year, I opened an issue over on the HTML spec about JSON modules. So as mentioned earlier in this conversation, one of the kind of driving goals of the ESM implementation in Node with the current team is web interoperability. And so Node historically has the ability of bringing in a whole bunch of different module types. So you can require not only a common JS module, but you can require JSON, you can require .node, which are Node native modules. JSON is one in particular that is a really, really great user experience. And one of the amazing things that we've been seeing happen in the last little bit with the modules team is user experience from Node affecting web standards. This is what we're seeing with import maps, which is something that we can talk about later, that allows bare imports in the browser. So that's the ability to like import Lodash, excuse me, and the environment then knows to find that in Node modules folder. This is kind of an invaluable user experience, and requiring JSON is one of those. In the browser today, if you want to take some JSON and get it into a module, you need to use the fetch API. You need to then fetch the resource. You need to then wait to get the response. Then with the response, you need to call .json, and then you get it. And you've gone through 2 different promises, and you only have the value asynchronously. And you know, that is less than desirable. There's if you're fetching something that's based on like the root, then you also need to use import meta to get the URL. There's a lot of steps that you need to go through as compared to import thing.json. So the feature was requested in the HTML spec. It got specified. It landed in the HTML spec. And then at TPAC, which is the conference for the W3C, a number of browser vendors, implementers, noted some security concerns with this model. Specifically, that if you imported thing.json and a server or man in the middle to that server sent you back a response that was JavaScript with the MIME type text.javascript, that with the specification that we had done, that module would have just executed, which is not what the expectation of the developer who imported the JSON wanted to have happen. And this was identified specifically as a very strong security concern. JSON modules, in turn, then were reverted from the HTML spec. And the challenge was put to kind of the authors of that spec and those who are interested in seeing JSON modules and other module types to come up with a way of averting the security concern. Another thing with JSON modules, and the reason it was pushed for, is because there's a number of other module types that we'd love to see be able to be imported, including CSS modules, HTML modules, WebAssembly modules, and JSON modules were identified as a module type where the behavior was not very controversial. So, you know, we could focus more on implementation details to figure out what like blockers would be for all these various module types, this security concern being one of them. So the module attributes proposal, which is currently stage 1 at TC39, is one attempt to solve this. It is a stage 1 proposal, which means that the committee has agreed to exploring the problem space, but has not agreed on the shape of the solution, nor has agreed that this necessarily will land in the spec. So this is still very much, you know, up in the air. The module attributes proposal will allow you, when importing a module, to give additional metadata to what the module is. So what that metadata exactly is and how it syntactically works has not been agreed upon. One type syntax would be like import thing.json as JSON would be one potential syntax. So an extra attribute you add at the end to let the environment know what type of module it is. This would be considered in-band metadata to support, you know, some sort of enhanced validation. Another possibility would be an object or type would be one attribute, and then, you know, embedders that would be Node or Chrome or environments that embed the JavaScript language would be able to pick any number of potential attributes that they may want to see verified or extra data about the module. This is still one of the things that's being debated by the group. Now, how this affects Node's ESM implementation is, with our hope to have web interoperability, we do not support by default importing JSON. You need to actually give a flag for experimental JSON modules, and the implementation that we have under experimental JSON modules is based on the now reverted HTML spec that had those security concerns. Now, where this becomes interesting for Node, and I'm sure Brad, who has their hand up, could add to this, would be that, you know, the concerns that we have right now, security-wise, for the web platform doesn't necessarily apply to Node. And this is one of the ongoing challenges that we have in our module system, which is like, what user experience concerns or limitations should we have on the implementation in Node that are browser-specific concerns to better support interoperability between the environments. On the flip side, you know, what concerns and changes should the browser side make, you know, because of server-side concerns? And we're always kind of walking that line of interoperability and user experience and trying to find a balance. At least for myself, selfishly, I would love to see the two environments as much as possible be interoperable. And I am personally willing for to see a little bit of developer experience concessions in the name of interoperability. But I know that we do not have complete consensus within the modules team around this. Brad, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so there's a lot, but there's just a few key things here. One is, when we're talking about these security concerns, we're not specifically talking about loading JavaScript being the only concern. We're talking about executing code being a concern here. So the way that ES modules were specified, they were never meant to only load JavaScript, which is interesting. Way back in 2015, when it landed, every kind of ES module actually inherits from an abstract module record. These abstract module records were designed in a way so that it could support any number of languages. And we're starting to see other languages use this. So things like WASM could potentially also have the same concern here, where if a person returns a WebAssembly and that type is able to execute code when it is returned to the browser, it would be the same kind of man-in-the-middle issue going on here. So like Myles was talking about, these are going to be things where it's kind of consensus with two conflicting points of view going on. One thing to note here is, although we've been talking about the potential for checking the type of a dependency, that's not the only thing that the module attributes proposal is really able to do. So there's a variety of other constraints that exist. Things like in the service worker world for the browser, they're considering preventing people from using top level await when you first load a service worker, because it's a problem for the browser there as well. So you could see more attributes show up that do things like prevent top level await from being used inside of a dependency. There are different tools that are looking at how they could use things, like Babel is looking at how they could use it for different kinds of transforms of dependencies. Excuse me. Basically, what we've got here is a very generic proposal that isn't purely about any sort of conflict between the browser and Node, but about how we can use all this metadata in different ways. We've been talking about the module attributes proposal in TC39 as an in-band way of doing all this. There's also been some discussion of doing it out of band. So there are ups and downs of doing it either way. Maybe we'll do it both ways, where you could have both in-band and out-of-band metadata associated with your imports. But right now, it's a stage 1 proposal. Be prepared for very massive changes. They may happen, and that's it for me.
Not sure who was first, Myles or myself.
It was you.
All right, so we'll quickly.
Jan, why don't you?
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, what I was quickly going to say is what I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with is phrasing it as a conflict between browser and Node. In some cases it is. In some cases it genuinely is something that only applies to the browser and something that only applies to Node, and there needs to be made some kind of trade-off. But for example, the browser idea of, hey, if you load a file from a remote URL and you expect it to be JSON, but then it suddenly executes code, could also apply to a future version of Node that supports HTTPS URLs. So it's not necessarily a browser concern. It's more any kind of engine that fetches from a potentially untrusted third party concern. And at the same time, concerns around polyfillability, like the ability to support browsers that don't support or have not support added yet for new module types, is something that applies to the browser and also to some degree then applies to Node. Like for example, if you have an attribute as CSS, you load that module in a browser that doesn't have support for CSS modules yet, the server cannot provide a polyfill as a JavaScript module because it would be rejected by another browser potentially, or rather because most likely the browser not supporting SCSS would just completely reject the whole thing. So I think that some of these concerns are more about capabilities of the engines and not necessarily the engines themselves being fundamentally at odds in what their goals are. I think the goals of the browser and Node are much more aligned than many people give it credit for.
Yeah, I guess like a couple things I just want to add to that really quickly, and I'll hand it back to Brad. One of the concerns that is being discussed by the champion group working on the attributes proposal is about how much flexibility there should be in the proposal, which I know even members on this call don't totally agree on yet. But you know, whether or not it's a single attribute to solve just this case of identification of the type of module versus like n number of infinite properties is a point of contention, because this is a place where there could be massive divergence between environments. So a great example of this is like sub-resource integrity. So sub-resource integrity for a module, you could supply like an MD5 or a SHA-256 of the source that you're importing. And on the surface, this would seem like a really great thing to be able to provide in line if you're importing, especially, you know, like if you're in a browser and importing a resource over the network. Now, one of the challenges though there would be this isn't super scalable. If you have a large graph and you're including resource integrity for every single module inside of your graph, and then you have a single cycle, you can't really resolve including inline sub-resource integrity with cycles and graphs. It's not possible. Then further, like the second that one thing in your graph changes, that propagates through the whole graph. So, you know, including sub-resource integrity is something that had been discussed at the committee, and, you know, Chrome was not very in favor of it. Now, we could see a world where one JavaScript runtime, and this doesn't even mean a browser, this could be Deno, this could be Node, this could be a new runtime, decides to introduce a new attribute for sub-resource integrity. Now, what do other environments do? Do they throw on sub-resource integrity existing if it's not an attribute that they support? Do they even need to know that it exists? If people start publishing code that has sub-resource integrity in line there, you would expect that it's validated to some extent. You don't want the code just running and ignoring it. And so this creates like just one example of a really weird mismatch that could exist between different environments. So to myself, this is a concern that I have with the attributes proposal, specifically that things could become inconsistent between environments and be inconsistent in a way that can either be wrong or at worst problematic. Don't have an answer to that. Don't know if this is even a concern that's large enough to stop that from happening. But it is something that I think various embedders such as, Chrome or WebKit or Node need to actively be thinking about how coordination around these attributes would work if we kind of want to make attributes this infinitely extensible thing. Brad, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, so this is like step back to Jan's point a little bit. So we have actually discussed, in case people are wondering what it would take to load HTTPS in Node. I think that leads into another question, but I just want to try to table all the security discussion about doing so. There are a few documents, if people want to dig them up, about security models for remote code loading for Node, but maybe that's better on a different call because that'll eat up a lot of our time. So, yeah.
Thank you, Bradley, so much for being considerate about our time. Geoffrey, you wanted to?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that other question about loading from HTTP URLs. Just a few days ago, we landed a PR for support for the loaders in ES module, which are still very much a work in progress and experimental and will change significantly between where they are now and when they eventually get unflagged. But one of the examples that we were playing with and that we put in the docs is a loader that just enables this of loading a module from an HTTP URL. And I wrote the docs for this, and one of the things I wrote is like, well, keep in mind, there's a reason that this doesn't exist in Node yet. Like, consider, you have to figure out caching, you have to figure out security, and there's a lot of difficult pieces to work out to do this properly and do this in production, like if Node were to support it as a feature. So yeah, it's something that is doable through custom user code at this point, but it'll be a significant effort to make that something in Node proper. And you just see what's kind of involved. It's one of the core features of Deno, and you can see how much work they put into it with caching and resource integrity and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks everybody else also for this amazing discussion. The only unfortunate problem is that y'all used all the wrong words, so now I'm on to you. And you talked about Deno and security and integrity and everything. So moving on, are there any plans for loading a module from a fully qualified URL as Deno does, or as browser ESM does, for example, and adding on to that my own, second part is that now that Deno also supports, so do you think there's any future for URL modules from URL as well as import maps inside of Node.js? Okay, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, the quick cop-out answer to the question as phrased is you can load from a fully qualified URL today. It just happens to be a file URL, file protocol URL. So we definitely set up the whole module system in a way that it is based on URLs. And for people who are not aware, CommonJS is definitely not based on URLs. CommonJS is based on file paths and platform-specific file paths and file names that can contain characters that make it look like URL, even though it is a file path. So CommonJS was never designed to support an extension to load other kinds of URLs other than files. Modules very explicitly is designed to support loading all kinds of URLs. So for example, one thing that Bradley implemented in the past was loading from data URLs. You can actually import, not sure if you need a flag or not, but you can generally import from a data URL. You can use data URL, import that, and it works. So, and Bradley just confirms no flag needed for the data URLs anymore. So we generally want it to enable other kinds of protocols, for example, HTTPS in the future. So the reason that it's not done yet is that, as Bradley kind of hinted at, the exact details of what it would do are definitely uncertain. Just because nobody really knows what it would mean for Node to out of the box allow you to load code from random HTTP URLs and immediately execute it. Especially things like dynamic import make it interesting what happens in those cases, because it's something that Node never used to do. And so people are rightfully curious what it would mean for Node. But yeah, generally speaking, it's not ruled out that it might become a built-in capability at the future, as far as I know, at least. And as Geoffrey kind of hinted at, it's definitely, at least in the latest status of the master branch, something that can be done relatively easily using a userland loader.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of second that. So, like Jan was saying, the new ESM-based system for loading modules actually is fairly different under the hood in how it's storing modules. It is not reusing some of the features that people have historically seen, like using require.cache. It actually has an entirely different store based upon the URL that a module is located at. So there is, in some way, the ability for you to kind of fudge things with require.cache right now in ways you can't for modules. So what we're working on really recently is making new PRs, adding features to these experimental loaders in order to get their usability and feature set up to the point where we are comfortable moving forward with them. I think that's going to be probably our priority over trying to make a massive push to get all the security aspects considered for loading HTTPS. So we've had some discussions in the past about loading different HTTP or HTTPS modules off the network. There's been a few things in the security working group, a few documents about this, but really the sense I've gotten from every discussion there is they would need to use some sort of policy feature in order to lock them down for you to use them by default. People are very concerned with loading things off the network if you cannot verify what you're going to be loading. This is kind of in the same vein as what we were talking about with module attributes, where if you load something off the network and it does something different from what you expect, that can be problematic. In particular, this is really a concern for Node. Node has a different architecture than Deno. So Node actually runs in a single process, Deno does not. So isolation is a big concern for Node. Also, the ability to load C++ modules is something you can do in Node, as well as, executing shell commands. So we have to figure out how we're going to kind of make a story for how you can lock that down before we can really go into discussion about loading HTTP in core. That said, it's something I definitely would like to see in the future, but it probably would require a bunch of extra steps for it to be enabled, and it probably wouldn't be enabled for every URL. You'd probably have to whitelist things from the discussions I've had so far. That's it.
Yeah, one small thing I'd love to add to this, and I think it's, you know, a great example of why interoperability can help us in ways that are unexpected. You know, moving forward with the module attributes proposal, and if Node adopts it, independent of whether or not Node today, you know, needs all the benefits that come from it, you know, standardizing around and implementing kind of these core features that think about all the use cases for all the different embedders leaves that design space open for us. So something like module attributes for JSON modules, as opposed to just landing JSON modules, means that if, you know, Node follows suit and this gets standardized, that if we do eventually introduce HTTPS or the ability to fetch resources over the network, we've kind of built in some of that security model by adopting these features. I think this is just a good thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about, like, hey, you know, does this or does this not benefit Node? It can, you know, future-proof for some design space. Now, whether or not it's always, you know, worthwhile to think about things that way is up in the air, but it's just, you know, it can be a benefit. Brad?
Yeah, just to clarify, we're not talking about Node and web browsers sharing the same security model, because we pretty much know we can't do that. We're talking about reusing the same infrastructure, potentially, the same kind of feature set to give that configuration that Node may want or the browsers may want in different scenarios. So yeah, I totally agree. We could come up with something. That said, module attributes is stage one. Let's not hop on any bandwagon until we get a little bit more design discussion on that one. But yeah, definitely feel like we have some room to agree on a central configuration mechanism. So that's good.
Thank you, Bradley and Myles, for the amazing insights. Actually, now that we're nearing the end of the EMA, I'd actually like to highlight it's really interesting, and I actually take a lot of pride in this, that we talked a lot about TC39 stuff today, and also given the fact that out of the 5 people in the panel today, I'm not sure about Geoffrey and Yan, but at least the 3 of us have been more heavily involved in TC39, at least as of late. So I'd like to point out how you know, things have consistently improved when it comes to the representation of Node.js people inside of TC39, and the amount of you know, consideration that has been given to Node.js as a runtime in TC39. And actually, I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts on that, and also discuss some of the issues that we have had in the past when dealing with especially the modules.
I would just like to say, I think TC39 is much better about getting feedback from its ecosystem these days. I know I joined TC39 and GoDaddy paid for it since it's a cost membership based upon modules. I think the ecosystem feedback is so credible nowadays that we probably wouldn't encounter the same sort of scenario anymore, especially with the stage system in place.
Great. Myles, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess just as a parting note, it's like it's been a long journey, but we're almost there. And it's pretty exciting. But with that being said, there's always something showing up.
Yeah, indeed. thank you all for your time, and a special thank you to all our listeners for the amazing questions and also for being involved in the community. I'd like to prompt everybody who's interested, especially in Node.js and ECMAScript modules, to help out uh, in the modules working group. The modules working group has been accepting new people as observers and eventually as members of the working group. So that's a great thing to work on. And I'd imagine there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So that's it, I think.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.